By way of a short introduction to the project, the Basic Income in Belgium project is a collaboration, a full-year collaboration between 4 research teams and 3 universities. The KU Leuven, University of Leuven, University of Antwerp, and the UC Louvain, Université Catholique de Louvain. It's a collaboration between research teams, including diverse perspectives on basic income. The team includes advocates of basic income. The team also includes skeptics of basic income. The team also includes people in between. But the team is also diverse in terms of perspectives, in terms of scientific backgrounds and the scientific methods being used. And so it is this heterogeneity and diversity that is actually fueling a whole range of empirical and theoretical research on basic income. We also gratefully acknowledge funding by the Belgian Science Policy Office at BELSPO. So we're focusing on Belgium in this project, and many of you might ask why the focus on Belgium? Well, Belgium is a developed, fully fledged welfare state and comes with a sort of complicated set of rules, legislation, schemes and institutions, and multiple layers of cash benefits. And a focus on Belgium as a particular case of introducing basic income, given this complexity, is something different entirely than implementing a basic income, for instance, in developing countries or at smaller geographical entities. And so focusing on one developed welfare state in Europe really enables us to take a deep dive into the issue of basic income, but with lessons that might be generalizable to other European and OECD countries as well, because of course the complicated structures and institutions of welfare states are shared among many countries in Europe and across the OECD. Basic income has been called a disarmingly simple idea. And of course, that is true. Basic income is a universal, unconditional, regular cash income for everyone in a given political community. So basically, no questions asked. However, discussing concrete basic income proposals quickly descends into a sort of a Tower of Babel-like dispute. When advocating or criticizing basic income, proponents and opponents often seem to have different kinds of a basic income scheme in mind. And it is quite obvious that the actual outcomes, the actual political feasibility of a basic income, certainly in the context of a developed welfare state, will be highly dependent on the choices made with respect to, for instance, entitlement, generosity, financing, and practical implementation. Details truly are important. Certainly so in the case of long-standing welfare states, with highly bureaucratized, complicated, and ever-evolving set of fiscal policies, social insurance schemes, minimum income schemes, and social assistance benefits in place. And so in this project, we took the prospect of implementing basic income in Belgium seriously. And in doing so, we started from the following assumptions. That the basic income proposal in such as Belgium can only inspire welfare reform if there is, first of all, sufficient support by the public and by the gatekeepers of the welfare state. Gatekeepers of welfare state being social partners, being political partners, but also, for instance, trade unions who are playing an important part in managing and governing the social security system. It can inspire welfare reform only if it leads to better outcomes in terms of poverty reduction at a given budgetary cost compared to what is already in place. And it can inspire welfare reform if it does not negatively affect labor supply too much, because that is a highly politicized issue and a main focus of policymakers in terms of welfare reform. And so starting from these assumptions and given the fact that, basic income proposals starting from a very simple idea might actually in practice be very different, we try to investigate 3 particular objectives. First of all, to investigate the redistributive, budgetary, and employment consequences of a variety of basic income proposals and basic income varieties. To investigate the legitimacy and the political feasibility of these proposals, including the feasibility and support amongst these gatekeepers I mentioned. And in doing so, trying to collect and disseminate new experimental data and make that data available for the research community at large according to open science principles. And so we hope that the data and the findings that emerge from this project and that we will now present to you will hopefully inspire both scientists and policymakers for the years to come. So in what follows, we will first present the data collection, followed by a summary of the results presented by the research team in terms of poverty reduction and budgets, in terms of employment impacts, and in terms of political legitimacy and feasibility. So I would like to thank you all for participating in this seminar, and I'm happy to give now the floor to Tijs Laenen, who was the coordinator of the project. Tijs, you have the floor.
Thank you, Wim. I hope you can all hear me well and see me well. I'm having a bit of internet connection issues today, so I hope that these do not disturb the presentation. If they do, please let me know in the chat. So as Wim already introduced, I wanted to give you some information about data and methodology that we have used and developed in the BABEL project in order to give you sufficient background for the results that we will be presenting later on, and also hopefully to trigger your interest a bit in these results and in finding out more about it. So in terms of the data and methodology, as Wim already introduced, we have these three themes or objectives in our project, which you can also find in the program. And for each of these objectives, we gathered mostly new primary data. For the poverty effects of UBI, these are microsimulation models that are based on Euromod and EU-SILC. For the labor supply effects, we collected 2 waves of the BABEL survey, and in addition to that, a Win for Life survey. I will explain all these in the next slides. And for the third objective regarding political feasibility, we gathered again 2 waves of the BABEL survey, and we also conducted qualitative elite interviews. Now I've put these 3 objectives or these 3 themes kind of in silos here, but I will, through the presentation, also show you how we made connections between the different teams in terms of the data that we have gathered. So first of all, the first theme regarding poverty effects. So our question there was more generally, how would the introduction of a universal basic income affect poverty in the context of the Belgian welfare state? And we chose to use microsimulation modeling rather than its main competitor in this regard, which are policy experiments. And we did this for 2 main reasons. First reason is that microsimulation modeling allows us to implement, between brackets, a universal basic income on a larger scale, namely for the entire country, for the entire economy. We could assess what the effects are of introducing a basic income in Belgium. Secondly, and that's very important, it also allows us greater variation in terms of the policy design of that basic income and its interaction with the existing welfare system. So microsimulation allowed us to vary the way a basic income would be financed, its amount, and so on. And we will find that's kind of a prelude on the findings, not only about poverty effects, but also about the other themes, that the devil is very often in the policy design detail. But that will become much clearer later on. Of course, the disadvantage, because we're also critical about the data and methods that we use, is that these kind of static microsimulation models that we have used, they give us very little information on possible behavioral effects of UBI and their potential impact on the poverty effect. And so in order to deal with that, we have also tried to look at labor supply effects, and we do that in a different way. Most of all, so our second theme, the main question is, how would the introduction of a UBI in Belgium affect citizens' behavior, not only in terms of their work, but also in terms of entrepreneurship, caring, volunteering, and so on. And we tried to assess this by conducting 2 surveys in which we measure self-reported behavioral intentions. So we ask people what they would do in case they would receive a universal basic income. And we did this in 2 waves of the Basic Income in Belgium survey. In wave 1, we had a vignette experiment in which we tested how people's intentions are affected by the stated policy design of a UBI. For example, its amount. Is it a high amount or a low amount? And how would that change people's intentions? In wave 2, we dig a bit deeper and we ran an information experiment in which we tested how people's intentions are not only affected by policy design, but also by the predicted impact that UBI would have on their household income. And this is where we make a first connection between the surveys that we have conducted and the microsimulations that we have ran, because the information that our survey respondents received was based on our microsimulation models, which showed who would win and who would lose under the introduction of UBI. So that's a first connection. This is an example concretely of how this looks. So this is an example of a vignette that describes the basic income. Now, every respondent received a different type of basic income. And then a few questions later, they were asked, well, what would you now do if you would receive this basic income? Would you quit work, volunteer more, and so on? Okay. Of course, the elephant in the room whenever you're working with behavioral intentions that are self-reported is how trustworthy are these intentions actually. And of course, you can have a whole debate, maybe in the Q&A later on, we can debate this. But there are certain theories, like the theory of planned behavior, that suggest or predict that intentions very often turn into actual behavior. But we don't want to just leave it up to theoretical ideas. We also wanted to test this. So we did this by fielding an additional survey among people who actually received a UBI-like payment. And those are the winners of the so-called Win for Life lottery in Belgium, which pays an unconditional cash payment to all the winners of that lottery for the rest of their lives. And we investigated in that survey how these winners changed their behavior after receiving these payments. But more on that in the presentation by my colleague Cyrille later on. 13, political feasibility. We issue that we might find certain basic income proposals or schemes that would succeed in reducing poverty, while at the same time not disincentivizing work or perhaps even incentivizing it. But we were concerned about, okay, but are these proposals then also feasible from a political perspective? We know that the technically most appropriate policies are not always the policies that are necessarily implemented because they have to go through a political process. And we identified 2 components to that question that, in our view, are interconnected. And the first one is, more broadly, how does public opinion think about basic income? And secondly, how do political elites feel about it? For the public opinion part of the question, we have gathered data in 2 waves of the BABEL survey. In the first wave, which was the same as the labor supply or the behavioral intentions wave, we assessed citizen support for basic income, not only focusing on the impact of policy design, but also on the impact of predicted policy outcomes. So in terms of what would it do to poverty, employment, entrepreneurship, and so on, and how does that influence citizen support? Now, in that first wave, the outcomes that we provided to our respondents were purely hypothetical. We made them up. But in wave 2, we examined the impact of more realistic scenarios in which the outcome that respondents were shown were actually based on our microsimulation models. And that's the second connection between the different teams, where we try to investigate how public opinion is actually influenced by evidence-based information. The second part of the equation has to do with political elites. And here in the first step, we conducted a document analysis of the official positions of political parties, trade unions, and employers' organizations in Belgium. But given that the information was relatively scarce and quite superficial, we wanted to dig deeper. And we also conducted a series of in-depth interviews with top-tier representatives of these different organizations in order to uncover their positions and arguments regarding a UBI. One final connection that we made is that we also investigated how these political elites, and in particular trade union representatives, how they respond to information about their members' attitudes towards the UBI as we measured it in our public opinion surveys. This is an example of our information experiment where you can see people received information about what the impact would be of a UBI on their household income and on the level of poverty. And each time they were asked their support about for a basic income. Okay, so this was kind of an introduction, or my colleagues will go much deeper into the details of the methods and especially the findings. So if you want to know more, don't go anywhere. It will only become more interesting when we go to the findings. You can also consult the project end report and the publications listed in that end report on our website, which is listed there. It's not the report's not on there yet. It will be on there in a couple of weeks. If you're interested, please let us know. And you can also check out our Open Science Framework page, which already includes the data from the first wave of our BABEL survey, and more data will follow there soon. Okay, so now I give the floor to Elise, who will give the next presentation.
Yes, thank you, Tijs. So I am Elise, and together with my colleagues, Yves, Gerlinde, and Toon from the University of Antwerp, we have tried to explore in our work package how a basic income can be designed to reduce poverty. I'm going to start with a disclaimer that, of course, reducing poverty and inequality is only one of the many goals motivating interest in a basic income. And that means also that the results and the conclusions in this specific work package are, of course, specific to the goal of poverty reduction in mind. So the main research question that we have tried to answer in this work package is, what are the consequences of implementing a universal basic income in Belgium? We have tried to examine the poverty and inequality outcomes of different basic income proposals. We have tried to shed light on who would benefit from these proposals and to what extent. And we've also tried to explore the impact of a basic income on work incentives. So as you can see, we had a strict focus on income only because of the methodology that we're working with. That means that other potential social outcomes of a basic income, such as income security, well-being, bargaining power, are not taken into account in our analysis. So our research method, Tijs briefly mentioned it already, is microsimulation modeling. So essentially, microsimulation modeling works by combining household survey data on incomes and characteristics across your population with information on how the tax benefit system operates or could operate in case of a basic income, of course. So that means that this microsimulation modeling allows us to answer hypothetical what-if questions without actually having to implement the policy. And given the fact that a basic income does not yet exist at the national level, besides experiments, this is really one of the only ways to have an idea on the potential outcomes of a basic income. And by then comparing incomes between our baseline, the current situation, and these different basic income scenarios, we can assess its aggregate budgetary and redistributive effects. So specifically, we have used the tax benefit model Euromat, which is a microsimulation model for all EU countries. It is a great tool, but of course has its own limitations. So first of all, it is a static microsimulation model in the sense that it assumes that behavior does not change over time. That means that we were only able to focus on what we call the first order effects, and that we cannot say anything about behavioral or long-term effects. So in that sense, our results should be interpreted in a way of the overnight effect or the morning after effect of implementing a basic income. And a second limitation is that we had to assume full take-up of rights. That means that if a household is on paper eligible for a social benefit, that we assume that they also receive that benefit. So in that sense, the results, especially for the baseline, should be interpreted as a best case scenario or how the system should work on paper. As our input data, we have used the European Survey on Income and Living Conditions. To avoid any influence of COVID, we decided to just stick with the 2019 input data and upgrade it to 2022. Because of course, this project has been going on for a few years and we have a lot of results. So given the time frame of my presentation, we decided to bundle our main findings in what we call takeaway messages. So the first takeaway message is that the poverty reducing impact of a basic income depends strongly on exactly how and where it is implemented. So let us first take a look at this table, which has a lot of results, but we'll go over it piece by piece. So we have 3 indicators in this table: inequality, which is measured by the Gini coefficient, the 60% poverty risk, and the 60% poverty gap. And then we have compared these indicators in the baseline with 6 different UBI proposals. So we started with 3 different levels of generosity. So a low basic income amount of about 200 euros for adults and 60 euros for children. A medium level of generosity, which we take an amount of 600 euros for adults and 185 euros for children. And the highest level of generosity, where we give an amount of about 1,200 euros for adults and 370 euros for children. And then our idea was for each level of generosity to explore 2 different design choices or funding mechanisms to really prove this point that apart from the level of payment, the design specifics and the nature of the funding mechanism are also major determinants of the effect that a basic income can have on poverty and inequality. So for the lowest level, which we fund by abolishing some of the existing tax advantages, we decided to explore what would happen if we do not include the basic income into the calculation of other benefits, so the means test, or if we do include it in the means test. For the medium level of generosity, we explored what would happen if we would fund it by abolishing all tax benefits, or if we would alternatively fund it by abolishing all social benefits. And then for the highest level of generosity, we had to finance that in any case by abolishing all the tax advantages and most of the social benefits. And then we still had to increase tax rates. So for this scenario, we explored what would happen if we would simply increase existing progressive tax rates, or if instead we would impose a flat tax. And then if we take a look at the results, then the first thing I hope you see is that it actually really matters, all of these different design choices, these ways of funding it. It has a major impact on what would happen with your basic income, its effect on poverty, despite the level of payments. And then a second observation that we can also make is that in contrast to common claims, we see that a more generous basic income does not necessarily yield more poverty reduction, especially compared to the size of the reform. We see that it's definitely not the case that the highest basic income performs way better than some of the low or medium scenarios. And if we think about the highest, which would have a cost of about a quarter of GDP, in that sense, our results point to some doubt whether such a full generous basic income scheme is the most cost-efficient way in Belgium of addressing poverty and inequality, and that a lower partial basic income that does not replace our existing social protection system, but instead is some kind of top-up or additional universal layer might make more sense. So I think the main message here is that when thinking about the impact of a basic income on poverty and inequality, that we have to recognize UBI's multidimensionality. I think the simplicity of a basic income is overstated, and implementing it requires far more choices than many seem to realize. And these choices actually matter. Which parts of the existing tax benefit system do you maintain, or do you abolish, or modify? Is the basic income made taxable? Are the amounts of other benefits affected by the basic income? All of these interactions and issues, they really matter, but they hardly feature in basic income debates. And then finally, I've only shown you the table with the results for Belgium. We have done a similar exercise for the Netherlands with comparable basic income scenarios. And there we also saw that the impact of a basic income, whether it is a low or a high one, also strongly depends on the country's specific context. So that is both the institutional context and the existing tax benefit system, but also the composition of the population. And in that way, a basic income scheme that reduces poverty and inequality in one country will just not necessarily have a similar effect in another country. So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. So with these results, we want to show that instead of making all these claims either in favor or against the basic income, it is very important to recognize that your outcomes will always be strongly dependent upon the level of income that you provide, how you design the basic income, and also in which country you implement it. Then the second takeaway message is that a basic income cannot escape the trade-off between social desirability and political feasibility. So here we are looking at the patterns of winners and losers, of course, in the financial sense. So winners are households that experience a gain in their net disposable income as a result of the basic income, and losers are those, of course, experiencing a loss. And whether your household would be a winner or a loser is then going to depend upon whether the amount of basic income that you receive surpasses any loss of social benefits or increased taxes. So these are the same six scenarios as from the previous table. So these are the losers and these are the winners. And then if we think back at which scenarios were the most effective in improving poverty, these were this one, and this one. And then we see that exactly these scenarios are also the ones that have the biggest shares of losers. So it seems to be that if you want to design a basic income so that it can have a big impact on poverty, that this would come at the expense of losses for a large share of your population, indicating this trade-off between social desirability, wanting to reduce poverty, and political feasibility, having these large losses for a big share of your population. And also, if we take a look at these dark reds and dark green parts, these are the people that have gains over 10% of their income or losses over 10% of their income. We see that actually the more generous or the higher the basic income amount is that you give, the more there will be people with very significant gains, but also the more people there will be with very significant losses. And if we then consider that people weigh losses more heavily than gains, this calls into question the political feasibility of this type of reform again. And again, it seems to be that at least if you want to prevent these large losses, that a partial lower basic income makes more sense. Then we also explored the impact of a basic income on financial incentives to work. So we calculated the average marginal effective tax rate. So this is an indicator for people who already have work, what their financial incentive would be to either increase working hours or to increase their wage. We also calculated the average participation tax rate, and that is an indicator for those who do not have work, what their financial incentive would be to take up work. So to move from benefit dependency to having a job. And here we have three scenarios, which are slightly different than the scenarios from the previous slides, because it's a different study, but still very similar. The first one is, again, a lower amount financed by abolishing all tax benefits. The second one is a slightly higher amount financed by abolishing all tax benefits and all social benefits. And the last one is, again, the amount of 1,200 financed by abolishing all tax benefits, social benefits, and increasing tax rates. And then first of all, again, the impact on work incentives is highly dependent on what sort of basic income proposal there is. And if we compare the different indicators, then we see that the scenarios that manage to reduce poverty are the ones that have a negative impact on the financial incentive to work, while the scenario that increases poverty is the only one that can lower incentives to work. So again, there appears to be this trade-off in design between wanting to reduce poverty and wanting to maintain or improve work incentives, which is again important for political feasibility. And that brings me to the third and final takeaway message, which is that a UBI would put singles and single parents at a relative disadvantage compared to larger families. So the last decades, advocates of equality, and especially gender equality, have pushed for rights that are independent of marital status or household context. And a basic income then perfectly fits up their alley as it is granted on an individual basis. And this is an example of a fully individualized system. And we do see in the last decades that we are moving from this male breadwinner model towards this more individualized adult worker model. But at the same time, we also know that both research and policy has long recognized the importance of economies of scale and that people have different needs that differ between households. So we realized that yes, social rights can be individualized, but poverty will remain a household concept. And we felt this tension. And once we empirically started to look into it, we realized that the principle of individual rights sits fundamentally uneasily with the empirical realities of household economics. Because the reality simply remains that two adults that live together, they need less joint income to achieve a similar living standards as someone that lives alone. So here again, we're looking at poverty overall, but this time also differentiated by family type. And we're looking at the last scenario of the financial work incentive slide. So the highest full basic income amount of 1,200. And then if we look at simply the overall poverty risk, then our conclusion would be, yes, this proposal would decrease poverty, which of course is great. But if we differentiate it by family type, then we actually see that it only decreases poverty for couples and larger families, but it increases poverty for singles and single adults. And it goes even further than just poverty. If you take a look at the pattern of winners and losers, we see that a basic income would shift purchasing power from one adult to multi-adult households. And that is because with the basic income now, we are taking the individual as a beneficiary unit, and we're also giving similar benefit levels to all households. And this is going to ignore this empirical fact that there are economies of scale and that households have different abilities and different opportunities. And also, we know that single parenthood is far more common among women. So we were curious about the gender effects. And then we also saw that male-headed households would be far more likely to benefit from such a reform compared to female-headed households. So I think this also strikes a blow against UBI's gender egalitarian credentials. Of course, we are not saying that there are not legitimate reasons to argue for individualized rights and an individualized tax benefit system. There are definitely legitimate reasons, but we do have to be aware of the far-reaching distributive implications. And that brings me to the conclusion, which I think can be summarized in just one sentence, which is that a basic income is not a miracle remedy for persistent poverty. Yes, if you design it in such a way, it can certainly help to reduce poverty, but it will always come at the expense of significant shares of the population incurring significant losses, especially then amongst singles and single parents, higher levels of spending, and this usually also taxes, and weaker work incentives, which all matter for feasibility. So I think especially for Belgium, I think our results, if we want to move towards a basic income, I think our results point to implementing a more partial, modestly generous basic income scheme where we retain at least some of the existing means tested or household targeted benefits. That seems to make the most sense, at least, as I mentioned in the beginning, if income inequality and poverty reductions are the goals. Because of course, going for a partial basic income scheme also means giving up the advantages of having what we call the radically simplified welfare system, because now we are still having means testing and conditionality within the social protection system if we go for a partial basic income. And that brings me to the end. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Elise. For the participants, we have discussed for each team, we have invited an expert discussant to give comments and reflections. And for the first team, so the presentation that you just heard, we have invited Dr. Herwig Immervoll. He is a senior economist and head of social benefits and green transition at the OECD. He has also played a major role in developing Euromod, so the actual tool that we have used. And he has used that tool also to assess the effects of different social policy reforms, including a universal basic income. So I think he's an ideal person to give us to share his thoughts. So I give the floor to you, Herwig.
Well, thanks a lot. I hope you can hear me. Thank you, Elise. Thank you, colleagues. Thanks for having me. There's a lot to like about this project, not least the name, BABEL. I think it's fantastic in many ways. I think it's also timely, perhaps surprisingly. We had a sort of a spike in the interest on basic income a few years ago in the context of the discussion of new forms of work and how that would challenge our social protection systems. There were the high-profile policy experiments, of course, including in Finland and referendum in Switzerland and so on. That's a while back, but interest has not faded. I think there were interesting examples in the COVID and cost of living crisis of flat and sort of uniform support measures that resemble basic income in some way, although time limited, of course. There's also discussion in the context of the green transition of perhaps distributing new forms of revenues, like from carbon pricing, back to households in the form of lump sum payments, which again can be seen as resembling a basic income. So I think the topic is there to stay, perhaps rightly so. It's great, I think, in this project to have both advocates and skeptics involved, and presumably also colleagues who are a priori agnostic about the basic income. And I really like the links also that were explained between the different modules, especially perhaps feeding the simulation results into the survey, and look forward to hearing more about this later. But just focusing on this presentation, I think basic income debates are sometimes quite general and at a sort of an aspirational level, with advocates and pilot initiatives highlighting a host of possible benefits, but without necessarily being clear about the specific objectives of actually introducing a basic income, or about the precise parameters of the reform. So studies such as this one are very necessary, I think, and very welcome. They provide a very concrete flavor and input into the debate, and we've just seen that. And also, I think the scope and the focus of the analysis, with the focus on poverty, on gainers and losers, and on work incentives, are the right ones in my view. Of course, this is partly driven by the simulation method that is used, and debates of basic income. They commonly highlight a host of other impacts. Many of you are aware of them. For instance, promoting or enabling activities that have, in some sense, an attractive payoff for society, but can be costly for individuals, such as caring, training, social entrepreneurship, etc. But the results here are indeed key dimensions, the poverty, gainers, losers, etc., of any social policy reform, including basic income. So as Elise has said, basic income is simple, perhaps deceptively simple, but the existing social transfer systems and the associated tax systems are not. And so incorporating a basic income into a complex system indeed produces multiple effects, and they are also complex. In the granularity, they're sort of impossible to anticipate without the careful modeling as done by the authors here. So one one strength of the study is indeed to very clearly show the importance of specific policy parameters. And in a sense, to show also, when thinking about studying the impact of a reform, there is perhaps nothing special really about a basic income. And as for any other tax benefit reform, one needs to study very carefully the distributional outcomes and trade-offs in detail. And one can't generalize for basic income broadly because the different scenarios are so different. Nevertheless, I would like to maybe point out that some of the broader headline results can perhaps be derived also from available information, available statistics. And that's also useful when thinking about how to put results into context in a sort of international comparison. Because it can be useful for considering how a basic income might actually play out in different country settings. Of course, here the focus is on Belgium, and I think it's very convincing why this is useful. It's also useful because in an earlier exercise we focused on 4 countries, and Belgium was not among them. So it's great to have this as an added sort of data point or data points, many of them actually. And in Belgium, when looking across European but also OECD countries, we know that the benefit system is indeed actually quite a bit more targeted than in most OECD countries, with the poorest 20%, for example, receiving about twice the total benefits as the rich when one looks at working age people. So taking this as a starting point, if one replaces this targeted system with something more universal or something where everybody gets the same, would of course tend to make the overall system less redistributive. So I think this is a useful consideration when thinking across countries, in which countries maybe a basic income would, from a distributional point of view, have strong arguments behind it, and in which ones maybe there's bigger potential for generating losers or reducing redistribution. And second, I think a key challenge is on financing basic income. And so essentially dividing all spending on social benefits, which is one way of looking at a basic income, by the number of people living in a country. That's one concept one could get of a very strong redesign of the existing social protection system, and could give a sense of what amount of basic income would one actually end up when the entire spending on benefits is divided equally. So if one does this for Belgium, we found this amount works out to be just about 30% of a relative poverty line, which is striking because it means that if you don't do anything else, of course, the poverty effects can be very damaging. So in a sense, if basic income is a main pillar of where to become a main pillar of social protection, you would need to find a way to increase spending quite a bit in order to prevent negative poverty effects. And then that raises the issue as well, how do you finance that? And so in that sense, one needs to raise additional revenues and hike up taxes in one way or another. And those additional revenues partly indeed drive the patterns of losses and the impact on work incentives that also the authors find. I have maybe one or two broader reflections that not necessarily related to the precise scope of the analysis. I think time is limited. Let me just maybe focus on one of them, which is work incentives. I think that's one of the weaknesses in past studies of the basic income, including also the work that we have done at the OECD, where we actually haven't looked in detail at that. We've looked at work incentive measures like marginal effective tax rates and participation tax rates as done here by the authors. But what I really look forward to is the results of the lottery that were described in the introduction, because it's a very different thing of having a pilot where you give people a basic income for a limited period of time. The income effects that you would expect from that can be quite limited because people know there's an expiration date, including, for instance, in the pilot that we saw in Finland. A lottery is very different, so I look forward to that. I will stop here, and thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Herwig. I suggest we teams. Thank you for your feedback. You will get answers or insights into the questions that you just raised in the next presentation where we will say something about the Win for Life lottery survey. Okay, so I suggest that we stick to the timing that was in the program and that we meet again at 1. So everyone can quickly grab a coffee or whatever you want to do in those 9 minutes that you have as a break. That's okay.
Okay, I will start slowly to start the presentation on work. So yes, I have been the one working on work in the team from KU Leuven, and we have analyzed several ways to analyze employment. But I will first start with why we focus on employment, as has been shortly already introduced. So basic income allows us to rethink about what we consider as work, in our current welfare state, we often ignore unpaid labor, which then people doing care, giving tasks or volunteering are not contributing to the system and then fall out from the protection that we provide with unemployment benefit or other kind of benefits. And basic income doesn't question what people have been doing in their life, how they have been contributing to the system. It considers a minimum security and a minimum support as given a right. And so by doing so, it invites us to rethink about those work that we haven't considered in our welfare state, and but did contribute to the society we live in. So people that currently don't receive a benefit for caregiving tasks would be receiving, for instance, such support. And that has a consideration for gender equality that we have been mentioning already earlier. But in that way, it would be potentially beneficial. And that's one of the questions we are asking, whether basic income could be a potential benefit for gender equality. But let's go back on the labor market. So we have concerns also that there would be a labor market impact. So since existing welfare benefits have put conditions to the to receiving benefits, which are usually work-related conditions, but also means-tested benefits. And basic income removes these conditions. And so the concerns that many people ask is whether it would have a work incentive effect. And that's what we are trying to analyze here. The gap in the literature that we try to respond to is that at the moment, the literature is quite focused on short-term experiments, which are limited on really specific targets, let's say unemployed or low-income earners. Then there is also the concern that we don't really have information about what kind of benefits or what kind of basic income has an effect and what kind of effect. So that's what we are trying to also answer. We also have limited understanding of what would people do with this extra time if they do reduce their time. Would it contribute to society in a different way? And then we also don't have much information about the gender-specific employment impact. So that's what I'm going to try to respond to: the labor supply effect, the behavioral impact beyond employment, and the gender equality question. I have implemented 4 methods to investigate this. First, systematic critical literature review, then a vignette experiment that has been introduced to you earlier, a macro-simulated informed experiment, and a lottery study. So the critical literature review, the idea was to gather existing literature and the findings that they come up with over 60 years of research, going back all the way back to the negative income tax studies in the US. And then first seeing what are the results and if there is a pattern. And the pattern that we observe is that there is limited impact on work. And that's interesting because they are quite different in the design. They are also quite different in the limitations. And that's what I'm also focusing in the paper, or we are focusing in the paper, is the methodological flaws related to each method. So we come up with a table which systematically reviews each limitation of each type of study. And that's one of the main contributions of the paper, is that we observe that there is quite a lot of limitations in the existing studies, and we are trying with our methods to offer a different take on it, different type of benefits, but also limitations. So we add up our own studies into this table, and we realize that they are not having, most of the biggest limitations are not present in our studies. But of course, we analyze intention and not actual behavior, at least until the lottery, which I'll present to you at the end. So the vignette experiments focused on 3,000 respondents that we have been introducing to you before. There's 216 scenarios that are randomly assigned to respondents. And then we ask them, what would you do with such an income? And then when we see the result of this intention-based survey, we see that most people do not want to reduce their work. The majority aim to keep working as much as they do at the moment. And that's interesting because some of the scenarios we had three amounts. We had 500, 1,000, and 1,500. And that corresponds to also really high amounts. There is some differences across the designs. But in generally, even when people receive 1,500 euros as a scenario, they still don't have such a high intention to reduce. So there is a motive to work that goes beyond just financial incentives, because some people in a household receiving 3,000 euros would have enough to live and could reduce their work. Of course, it depends on specific household composition and situations. But at least they could reduce more than what we see here. Then we also ask as you see in the list, I'm going to go back on the list, there is also more activities than just reducing work. There is also volunteering, taking care of a relative, or looking for a new job. These are all activities that could be beneficial for society if people manage to get a job as better than the current job, or train themselves, or take care of people. This is something that we have to consider, to not just seeing it in a binary way, reducing or quitting work, or remaining in their current work. And so that's what we are trying to do in our work, is trying to see what are the behavioral answers beyond work, because they could have significant positive effects on the society. And the current literature really focus on employment in a binary way. So in that, we try to combine those activities into several categories, whether they are economic or social, and we combine it with work. So if they reduce their work, what do they do? Do they do an economic activity, or a social one, or combination of both? None of them, or do not aim at all at reducing work. And we see that the majority of people in our survey answers that they are wanting to combine, to reduce their work and do something with it that could be social or economical. Then when we try to assess the design feature of basic income, because that's really one of the biggest advantage of this method, is the randomization of the scenarios. And with this, we can see that some benefit systems how some basic income have different impacts. For instance, amounts. Of course, the highest the amounts, that was kind of expected, that the higher the amount, the higher is the intention to reduce work. But they also increase intention to reduce work in a social way, so taking care of a relative, for instance. Then there is also the different type of taxes, and the universality features also impact the type of reduction of work. So now, when we look at the macrosimulation informed experiments, so we add to the survey, we focus on only 3 scenarios in this method, and we add the information that is provided by our macrosimulation experiments. And by asking people the socioeconomic characteristics, for instance, the income or the household composition, we are able to provide them with really specific amounts of how much they are predicted to get out of the benefit. And with this extra information, we try to bridge the information gap that has been present in the previous survey, being that, okay, they receive 1,500 and the social benefit will be cut in some cases, and there is an extra tax also involved. But what does it mean for them? It's really hard to get. And that's what we are trying to bridge here with the personalized financial impact. And we see, interestingly, that the results are pretty much the same in terms of reducing work, quitting work. We have also in here information about intention to increase work, which also represents a small share of our respondents. And then we also see that there is a variety of behavior or intention that goes beyond reducing work. Then when we try to focus on the gender questions, as I said, there is a debate. On the one side, some people say that it will be liberating women in the way that they would provide them with the support. And since they are currently experiencing in our traditional welfare system, but also labor markets structure, they are taking up the caregiving task, and they are receiving lower pension, lower social security benefits, and they have more precarious employment situations. The idea is that they would be providing them with financial independence more than men. And on the other side, you have the concerns from some feminist philosophers that it would reinforce traditional gender roles, as they would have an extra income that they would be able to reduce their work, and this reduction of work in the household is often taken up by women to take care of children or other household tasks. So we do observe in our results that there is a discrepancy between men and women. There is a higher tendency of women to intend to reduce work, and a higher intention to increase work by men. We can also see that across simulation results, that the intention or the gap between men and women increases over the higher the simulation is. Same goes for the scenarios, which the scenarios are going more and more generous from 1 to 3. So that we can also see here. Then finally, we observe this on real case scenarios through the Win for Life results. We combine the sample from our colleagues' study from 2004 with the one from 2024 to have a higher sample, as we had issues with our sample size. And we observe that even when they receive really high benefit in 2004, the benefit was 2,000 euros per month for the rest of their life. And we see that people generally don't aim at reducing work. It was only 5 people and 5 people quitting work, over 83 response in 2004. And 2024, we also see similar results. Here, the advantage that we have is that we have the lottery has introduced more benefit or more wins over time, from 500 to 5,000. Under 500, under 2,000, we have no reduction of work. But for the higher benefits, which are quite significant compared to what we consider in the basic income discussion, the reduction is a bit higher, but still not significant. We have 5 people reducing work and 1 person quitting work over 64 respondents. So the conclusion of all of this is that when we observe the existing literature in the literature review, we observe really limited reduction of work. But at the same time, we observe some limitations. So we try to provide extra sets of insights. And with this extra set of insight, we also see the same thing happening across the surveys, and whether it's intention or actual behavior. So that's an interesting insight into maybe the fear that we have on employment. This incentive is not as big as shouldn't be as big as it is at the moment, and that has implication for the political feasibility of a basic income, but also on the social desirability. So it also makes us rethink about our welfare state, on the conditions and targets that we have put in place, whether they have, if they are based on only employment incentive, whether they have empirical grounds, or they are more based on dogmatic or deservingness aspects, whether people in our welfare, if we put these conditions for those reasons, we should try to re-question our existing benefits. And then it also invites us to rethink about the method that we put in place, trying to find solution to the existing methodological limitation I have highlighted in the start. So yes, thank you for listening to me, and we can pass to the discussion.
Thank you, Cyrille. Can you click on the next slide, please? Yes, thank you. So we have asked Professor Loek Groot to be the expert discussion. Loek Groot is an associate professor at the Utrecht University School of Economics. He was involved, or maybe still is involved, in the UBI-inspired experiments in social assistance in a couple of cities or municipalities in the Netherlands, which was, by the way, also in the table that you showed, Cyrille. And it turns out that he also wrote a PhD about this topic exactly, called Basic Income and Unemployment, already in 1999. So we have a long-term expert that is undoubtedly able to shed some insight and new light on our findings. So Loek, I give the floor to you.
Yeah, thank you, Tijs, for this introduction, and thank you, Cyrille, for this presentation. And I also read your concept PhD, and I must say I'm very, very much impressed in what you have done so far. And you are almost at the end of your PhD. So yeah, I can only say that I am very impressed, and also saw your 2024 Socio-Economic Review article, co-authored by others, which is also very informative. And yeah, I have been asked to give a short reaction to this good piece of work. And the first thing that comes to my mind is that you provide information on the outcomes of different approaches to study the effects of implementing a basic income. And I wonder, would it not be possible to have a kind of synthesis So to synthesize all the results, taking into account that the shortcoming of one approach is not might be the strength of another approach. So that if you combine all the outcomes, all the results, can we then say something more definitive about what a basic income, what effects a basic income would have? Or it might also be that the outcome is, after the synthesizing effort, that we are still in the dark, that taking all the results together, we simply do not know yet what a basic income, what the effects would be. Secondly, I was a little bit, if I see the results of your different approaches, the vignette, the micro, and the windfall life, then the findings, the effects of basic income are much more positive if I compare it to a recent report by your fellow countrymen, de GAK-rapport, Feit en Fictie omtrent het basisinkomen. They were quite negative about the effects of basic income. The first order effects would not be promising, and also the second order effects, taking the behavioral effects into account. And also, if I contrast your outcomes with the findings of the Dutch Bureau of Economic Policy Analysis, the Central Planning Bureau, they have also done a few general equilibrium simulations, which, by the way, I am also missing in your overview table of different approaches, this slide 39, I believe. But they show that especially the negative labor supply effect is concentrated among secondary earners, and these are, in the Netherlands at least, predominantly women. Still, I think your work gives many insights, so I'm wondering, suppose that a big bang with implementation of a UBI is not likely in the near future, what are the first steps that you can still take, given that the Big Bang implementation is not likely, but based on your findings, you might already take a few first steps. For instance, in this GAK report, there was this issue of non-take-up of social benefit, which is a huge problem from a justice point of view. So you would say, if you would already have with automatic payment of social benefits, it presumes, of course, that the information system of the government is of excellent quality. Then this would already reduce a lot of, would already attain a lot of benefits, that the stigma to apply for a benefit is being removed. You might also take as a first step to make the whole social benefits not with family-based, household-based, but on an individual basis. So there are already a few steps that you can take before implementing a full basic income. And yeah, I have two more points if I have time. I would also, I'm curious, if you were in charge, what kind of study or follow up on the BABEL project would you order if you would be in charge of the European Commission or something? I'm very curious what kind of study still needs to be done if you have the power to order that study. Two final points. One, how to mitigate the potential negative gender effects. So are there any measures, any plausible, obvious measures that you can take if full implementation of a basic income would have a negative gender effect, that labor supply of secondary earners would decline, that you can take other measures at the same time to cope with that problem. And my final remark is this. Suppose that we are in the age of artificial intelligence and robots. And now suppose, for the sake of argument, that artificial intelligence and robots have a huge negative labor supply effect, so that the demand for labor would drop significantly. If that is the case, would it not be a good outcome if implementing a basic income would have a strong negative labor supply effect, so that you would welcome, rather than say this is a bad outcome of a basic income? No, it is a good outcome, because if labor supply drops due to a generous basic income, this will strengthen the bargaining power of those people who still want to work. If labor supply is still maintained, while labor demand due to robotization drops significantly, the bargaining power of the workforce will be much worse. Now, that is my final comment.
Okay, thank you very much, Luke.
Okay.
Cyrille, do you want to respond to something, or do you want to leave this for at the end of the session for the Q&A?
For the matter of time, I think maybe I take it then after, and then we have more room later, even if you want to extend it further, rather than extending the time now. Yes, is it okay for everyone if we answer to all of that later? Okay, great. Thank you for the questions, though. They're really interesting.
Okay, now without further ado, we can go to the third theme of the day, which relates to political feasibility.
Yes, thank you very much. So now we're moving to another dimension, or another work package that we have explored within the BABEL project. So I'm focused on public support, as you can see from the title. So in this presentation, I will give you a bit of information on the findings we have with regard to public support for basic income in Belgium and beyond, because I also have some findings on some neighboring European countries. Obviously, basic income is a popular or unpopular policy. So in recent years, we have seen a lot of prominent politicians integrating a basic income in their campaign in France, in the USA. But unfortunately, they have not really met great success. There was even a country, Switzerland, in which they put a basic income up for vote, and there again, it was massively rejected by most citizens. But nevertheless, there are still a lot of networks, intellectual networks, such as the Basic Income Art networks or other more politically minded organizations who are really trying to build a coalition around the concept of the idea of a basic income. But of course, basic income, as you have seen in this presentation, it's a very conceptually ambiguous term, policy proposal. It can be really implemented in different ways. And when people talk about basic income, they don't always refer to the same proposal. In the context of the project, we really started with this idea that the basic income is individual, universal, but obviously there is a defined eligible population and it's unconditional, but still in the way we have implemented it and have done research, we adopted a multidimensional approach in the sense that we define the basic income a policy that has different dimensions that can vary, and these dimensions have also a varying effect on people. And obviously, there are also different terms such as the negative income tax, which are cousins that also have other meanings, so framing differences. For the sake of example, I included this table from Laenen's book with the different policy design dimensions that can vary and which should be taken into account when talking about basic income in general. So what about the design effects? So when you look at the literature, for the research that has already been done, we know that the public is sensitive to the identity of the potential basic income claimant, with, for instance, people with a migration background, when it is specified that people with a migration background, immigrants, are included, that support for the basic income decreases. In terms of conditionality, there is a very strong attachment to imposing work requirements or other caring tasks. In terms of financing, people are very against raising taxes, especially income taxes. And for the integration dimension, people tend to favor a basic income that will be added on top of existing welfare benefits. And very recently, there also has been research on how these dimensions interact with each other. For instance, in the case of Rinkan, she has shown that when you combine progressive taxation with citizenship requirements, then you increase the support of the level of support. And the other way around, Laenen found that when you combine work requirements and you differentiate the level based on work trajectories, that the support level decreases. So these dimensions, they also have different effects when they are combined. In our project, we have found this in terms of design characteristics. In terms of generosity, it seems like Belgians are very much in favor of a very generous amount, which obviously poses questions when we think about the presentation by Elise. For conditionality, we find similar results. Conditionality is very much appreciated, so they really want, they are more in favor of imposing work or caring conditions before receiving the basic income. For the universality, it is less clear, but compared to a basic income that includes newcomers, when there are certain eligibility requirements, such as having the nationality or living in a country for a couple of years, then people tend to support it a bit more. For the integration, it's also a bit tricky to really see one clear pattern, but I think we kind of find the same result of previous research. People are more in favor of a basic income that will be added to the existing system. And lastly, the same thing with the taxes. When there is an increase in taxes implied, then people tend to reject the proposal. In terms of the outcomes, and I think my results are quite similar with Elise's conclusions. When there is a societal goal that is implied, such as reducing poverty or income inequality, then support increases. But when we mention that, for instance, unemployment will increase or the number of entrepreneurs will decrease, and the support level decreases. Next, the political economy of basic income. We also looked into the factors that are associated with individual support for basic income, and in this literature we find this idea of self-interest against egalitarian values. So people will think about what's in it for me, and others will think what's in it for society. And based on existing findings, we find that support increases for a young age, left political ideology, low income, and unemployment. So basically, when there is a precarious working condition of economic situation, people are more in favor of a basic income. So this is a figure from a result from one of my first paper. And here you clearly see that there is this ideological component. So the blue bars are the leftist and the dark blue the rightist, and then the yellow one the centrist. We really see that there is like this political divide between people at the left side being more in favor of a basic income, regardless of the dimension, and people at the right side very much being against it. You can see the same pattern when you look at the other dimensions, the amount and the taxes. And in another study, I kind of looked into it further, and I, for instance, saw that when you interacted different dimensions, you also saw this pattern in which people at the left side had reacted differently to dimensions that were interacted, and people at the right side, which kind of hints at this proposal of basic income being interpreted different ways depending on people's political ideology. Next, we also have published a media report in which we really analyzed the support for different types of basic income among different societal groups. We have three main conclusions. So there is a higher support among left-wing voters in Wallonia. There's a higher support among people who are critical of the welfare state, and there is a higher support among socially vulnerable groups. If you're interested in the findings, then you can check our website and read the full report. Lastly, I also, within the context of my PhD, I was also able to look at more cross-national findings and look at other European countries. And what do we know about, like, what are the findings about the institutional feasibility of a basic income? Yeah, first of all, there is a great variation between European countries, as you can see from the figure. But what we can see, what researchers have found is that material deprivation and social spending are very good predictors of support for basic income, in the sense that when there is a high level of material deprivation or low social spending, that support for basic income is higher. So there is like a need for basic income in certain countries. And very recently, researchers even found that there is a moderating effect of the welfare states. Typically, people who are welfare chauvinistic, so who want to restrict access to the welfare states in general, when their support for basic income is lower normally, but when they live in welfare states where the social spending is very low, then it tends to kind of decrease their negative attitudes toward basic income. And this is, for instance, what I found in my research, where I look at support for basic income that differs in conditionality and universality. First of all, the first graph, we see that there is also a great variation, but support level in Europe is kind of low. I mean, we're really kind of between 4.77, I think 67, sorry, and then 5. I mean, the highest is in Portugal. I can't really see the numbers, but yeah, we're barely reaching the midpoint, which kind of indicate that support is very low. And when you really break it down in terms of the different dimensions, we see it's a very clear pattern. In almost all countries in my data set, support for conditional basic income is always higher. And but in terms of universality, it is less clear. Sometimes people are in favor of basic income that excludes newcomers. Sometimes they're in favor of basic income that includes everyone, that's fully universal, and in certain cases, when it's universal for EU residents. And these findings were confirmed by also regression analysis, where I also found that in almost all countries, when it's exclusive, support level tends to when it's conditional, sorry, the support level tends to increase. And also compared to a basic income that is that includes newcomers, we see that in Europe support increases when it's exclusive. And when we run separate regressions for the different countries, we also see kind of a similar pattern as in the descriptives in terms of conditionality. It kind of seems to be clear that conditionality is more favored than unconditionality, and for universality, it is less clear. So my conclusions based on my presentation is, first of all, support for basic income is multidimensional and influenced by the key design features. And as you can see, it can really vary depending on what you propose to people. And this is kind of, I think, maybe for basic income advocates, something that they can use as an opportunity to build a coalition, as we don't have a real clear, as we can really define the basic income in different ways. Secondly, support for basic income aligns with the left-right political divide. I think it's kind of clear, based on my result at least, that this idea that basic income is a post-ideological proposal that transcends existing political divide seems to be rejected. We really clearly see this leverage to the right, where leftist people are more in favor and people at the right side are kind of less in favor of basic income. But nevertheless, the conditionality seems to be contested across the whole political spectrum. And lastly, in terms of the cross-national variation, for me, the support level is quite low across European countries. And we kind of see that people in countries where there is a need to have a stronger welfare state, there is a higher level of support, but it stays relatively low. And then lastly, globalization challenges the definition of basic income eligibility and conditionality. This may be an aspect that hasn't really been studied so far, but when we think about implementing the proposal, we see, based on the data, that it will be a challenge to define who is eligible and what conditions do we impose to this to people who are eligible, and that these two components will really have an effect on people's acceptability of basic income. So yeah, thank you for your attention.
Hello, everybody. I guess now it's my turn. So I'm Floriane Geels, and I'm a PhD candidate at UC Louvain, Saint-Louis, Brussels. And in the BABEL project, I've been working on UBI's political feasibility. And today I'm going to quickly scan my research results with you. And I apologize if the presentation feels a bit dense, but yeah, unfortunately, I don't have much time. So first, what do we mean when we talk about the political feasibility of UBI? Here I follow the definition by Jürgen de Wispelar and Antonio Nogueira, which is a quite broad definition. And in my research, I've specifically focused on UBI's political feasibility from the perspectives of key political and institutional actors. So I've studied the attitudes of political parties, trade unions, and employers' organizations towards UBI. And to already summarize my findings up front, well, for the time being and considering the medium term, the UBI proposal does not appear really politically feasible from the perspective of political elites in Belgium. But why is that? So I'm going to present three types of arguments informing actors' positions towards UBI that actually emerged during my empirical journey, which was based on analysis of great literature and interviews. These three types of arguments were strategic, ideological, and pragmatic. So let's start with strategic arguments on UBI. Well, those arguments are used by actors basically to reinforce or defend their position in the political arena and to adapt their stance on UBI depending on the broader context and also depending on their political competitors. And first here we find that, well, political interests in UBI tends to be cyclical rather than really following a continuous upward trajectory. On the Francophone side, we acknowledged political momentum for UBI, where almost all Francophone parties took a stance on the matter. And this was, among other reasons, often driven by strategic motives, such as the fact of responding to political adversaries' proposals. But this momentum has waned since 2022, and virtually no party has included again a UBI proposal in its platform for the 2024 Belgian elections. Besides, when Francophone parties did advocate for a type of UBI, and of course, those proposals were really different depending on each actor's ideological line, and I'll come back to this. So even when they had a UBI proposal, they often presented it as a theoretical horizon rather than a concrete reform that could, by instance, be part of government negotiations. And those UBI proposals, they were never really top priorities for the different parties. In addition, we've seen that the UBI topic has been less debated in Flanders. Several factors can explain this, but there's the fact that Flemish parties evolve in a political environment that has been more right-wing dominated and also marked by regional claims. And these dynamics reduce the incentive to support a national UBI reform, which is not really seen as politically attractive. Then alongside Marie-Laure and Tijs, we've also explored the reasons behind trade unions' reluctance towards UBI. And strategically, unions perceive UBI not only as a neoliberal threat to the social system and redistributive mechanisms, but also as a challenge to their own institutionalized role. And both trade unions and employers' organizations tend to believe that introducing a UBI in Belgium would, most probably undermine mechanisms of social dialogue. Now, turning to ideological arguments and also coming back to the different UBI proposals of Francophone parties, well, here it's important, and it has been said, to note that UBI is not a neither left nor right proposal. It's actually multidimensional. And hence, depending on the concrete modalities and characteristics of each UBI proposal, well, it can be entrenched in a more right-wing or, at the opposite, a more left-wing perspective. So we can say that it reflects classical left-right cleavage on issues such as the state's role, visions of the labor market, visions on social organization, etc. And a significant ideological factor I encountered is the strong work ethic upheld by nearly all the actors I interviewed. While some actors acknowledge that work could encompass more than just employment, these actors still insist on the fact that citizens should contribute to society. Of course, here again, it can be done through different modalities depending on each actor's philosophical line, but generally speaking, work is seen as the best protection against poverty and social exclusion, also seen as essential for society's prosperity. In the same vein, the unconditional character of UBI, so the fact that it is granted no strings attached, also faces criticism. For example, trade unions would rather defend existing mainly insurance-based systems, so not an unconditional one, and more liberal actors would emphasize activation measures. Similarly, the universality of UBI, so here the fact of providing the same amount of money to everyone, is seen as either inefficient, unfair, or a less optimal way of functioning compared to targeting specific population groups. Here, of course, I'm sketching a really gross portraits and I'm taming interactors' differences, but let's keep in mind that the framing of these social issues and debates varies among actors, with, for example, Flemish parties focusing on anti-poverty measures, trade unions emphasizing more solidarity, employers, organizations prioritizing productivity, and so on and so forth. Finally, all actors came with more pragmatic arguments. And here, the most widely used argument is the presumed unaffordability of UBI. This argument can come in different fashions, such as claiming that it would be a waste of valuable resources, arguing that public agencies should already be more accountable and efficient, or highlighting fiscal deficits and north-south transfers as barriers. Another pragmatic concern is the potential labor market impact, and we've talked about that. And from the perspective of political actors, so, at least some of them, in a context of labor shortage, especially in Flanders, while granting an unconditional income is seen as sending the wrong signal to workers or unemployment people, and basically is a risk to disincentivize employment. Then most of my interviewees agreed that it would be preferable to improve social protection within the existing system rather than implement UBI seen as quite uncertain or unstable measure. Employers' organizations also insisted on the lack of evidence-based reasons to adopt UBI, because UBI hasn't been implemented under a pure form anywhere, and they consider that UBI experiments yielded quite inconclusive results. Of course, and we mentioned that already, the multidimensional nature of UBI sometimes makes it difficult for stakeholders to grasp the full picture, and representatives would, for example, answer me in interviews, yeah, but what are we really talking about here when we talk about UBI? And many of those representatives do not really consider UBI as a pressing issue or even as a demand from their social basis. Hence, yeah, they tend to embrace a quite skeptical position towards the proposal. So, oops, I went too fast. So in summary, as I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation, the UBI idea does not appear politically feasible in the near future in Belgium, at least from the perspective of those political elites. But analyzing this debate highlights key challenges faced by the current social system, and by analyzing the positions of different actors and integrating it within the broader context, we can actually refine our understanding of broader social issues, and also explore convergences and divergences among actors. So that would be all for me. Thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, you can raise them here, or you can also contact me by email. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Floriane. Then I will give the floor to our invited expert, which is Professor Femke Roosma. She's an associate professor at Tilburg University and also a professor by special appointment at the Joep den Uyl Chair at the University of Amsterdam. And Femke is a renowned expert in the topic of the social and political legitimacy of the welfare state, and she has various publications on specifically on the topic of UBI as well. So I give the floor to you, Femke.
Thank you, Tijs, and thank you all for having me here. And of course, thanks Marie-Laure and Floriane for your very interesting work and presentations. It's also great to see these topics from the public perspective as well as the political perspective here in Alliance, because I think that's very relevant when we talk about political feasibility. So let me give some broader reflections on your work. I take it together, but maybe focusing first a little bit on the presentation of Marie-Laure and then on Floriane's presentation. But I think comments are relevant for both of you. And of course, I try to squeeze in some personal reflections on the matter. So first of all, I think that sometimes people ask me, why is it so interesting to study UBI support, because this policy doesn't exist and there are reasonable questions to what extent it will ever be implemented fully. And then I always claim that it's still interesting to look at it in depth, because I think that UBI is a very provoking idea, and it can really also trigger imagination of people of why or what kind of social policies they find important. So it's a great way actually to understand different policy design dimensions that are all included in UBI, and that can trigger people's imagination. And that's also, I think, very important, Marie-Laure, that you contribute to the increasing literature that studies these policy design dimensions within the proposal of UBI, because in this way it tells us not only something about support for UBI, which is, I think, relevant, but also about potential improvements of the current system of our current welfare states and current social policy schemes. And that's also something that politicians are interested in, like you mentioned, Floriane. So I think that's a great way to also make these types of studies, and also your study, Marie-Laure, relevant also for politicians to see what kind of policy design dimensions people support within the context of this bigger proposal. And if we then zoom out a little bit and ask ourselves the question, so what do people really want from UBI, or what do people really want from social policies? I think that now the pile of research is getting bigger and bigger on this topic. I think we can say some things on this. First, I think that the relatively big support for UBI, if you just ask, do you support UBI, then we find relatively large support. And I think that this really reflects that people do not want poverty in their societies, right? So people want to reduce poverty. That's also something that comes out of your study, Marie-Laure. Less inequality and no or reduced poverty. And at the same time, they still want reciprocity and conditions. And that's not only at the political level, but also at the individual or public level, so to say. And that's something that I think policymakers have to deal with, right? So we want to have less policy, but have also schemes that are in some way conditional or include some level of reciprocity. And then the question is UBI the best proposal for this, or are there related types of policies that can maybe gain bigger support? For instance, what was mentioned before, the partial basic income, still not conditional, but still triggers or incentivizes people to work. But also something like earning disregards for people on benefits, or maybe also a very interesting research angle for future studies is support for universal basic services. Because I still think, and that's also something that's not really reflected in both of your studies, but that I'm considering a lot, to what extent do people want to let the middle classes benefit more, right? So my gut feeling is that people want to exclude the rich, and that's the reason why they do not support universality to full extent. But they do want maybe to include middle classes or lower middle classes. So that's why I think that this policy proposal of universal basic services might be interesting also to look into, but also other ways to maybe in more universal but not entirely universal ways include the middle class in social policy proposals, and study political and public support to that. While still there are some challenges, right, in studying support for UBI. You have mentioned them, Marie-Laure, also in detail, right? The understanding of UBI is sometimes complex. There's some ambiguity in the concept itself. So I think that the ideas that there are in your team to include this information about the outcomes of UBI and the potential effects of UBI in survey studies, I think that's very interesting work to see how people respond to the potential effects UBI have and what kind of policies then they can support. Also, I think it's also important to consider that opinions on UBI do not form in a vacuum, right? So we know that, opinions might change, especially on topics that are complex like UBI. So more focus group discussions or more studying real world discussions on UBI, but also among politicians would be interesting to have politicians, to see if politicians have these debates and what types of policies they can support would be, I think, very interesting because these opinions, I think, especially UBI, is something that develops in people's minds when they talk about it. So that would also be, I think, interesting, directions for future research. Then, public support is not political support, right? So that's the public might be very enthusiastic about UBI, but then still politicians might prevent to implement it. And I think that the outcomes of your study, Floriane, are very interesting to see how politicians think about this, because it's very important to know what they want. And it's interesting to see that those who support it see it more as a theoretical idea or then rather a concrete policy reforms, or the political parties who say they support it do not have really clear ideas of how to implement it, which for me raises the question whether this is real support or is it cheap support, right? Do they really want to gain voters by it? But if they do not have real plans to implement it, is this real support from these politicians? Then I think it's interesting that considerations like work ethic and conditionality that really mirrors, I think, public opinion. So that's really something that you have to do something with if you want to implement a UBI-like policy. And again, the question here was, for me, what about middle classes? How do people see potential benefits of more universal benefits for middle classes? And how do politicians think about that? Then I think maybe as a final remark, what I found interesting is that politicians have all kinds of objections against UBI, but they do not mention things that I think are also important to them, which can be categorized under the category of blame avoidance kind of reasons. For instance, it's a big leap of faith, right? If you want to implement UBI, you don't know what the outcomes are. Even if we have great simulation studies, we do not know the outcomes in the long run. So it would be a very big leap of faith or a big step for politicians to implement this full UBI, which makes it already very complex for politicians to do that. And also because it involves ending policies that are relatively popular, right? So social policies in the end are relatively popular. So if you want to introduce something new and get rid of relatively popular alternatives, that's something that I think politicians would not do very well. And then finally, there are of course also transition costs. So if you think of implementing a new scheme, we know that like for all kinds of social policies, new policy schemes can run into to big issues. So that would also be a thing I think politicians consider, but they maybe not tell that in interviews, or maybe it would be interesting to ask them if these kinds of more practical blame avoidance arguments play a role in their considerations. So yeah, thank you for two very interesting presentations, and I think that it inspires for doing more research on this with in the back of our heads. I think ideas about how social policy schemes in general can improve and what we can learn for that from basic income support from politicians and the general public. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Femke. As the final speaker of the day, we still have some concluding reflections from our colleague Yannick Vanderborght. I will give the floor to you, Yannick.
Okay, thank you. And then we have time for Q&A, right?
Yes.
Okay. Hello to everyone. So my name is Yannick Vanderborght. I'm one of the co-promoters of this project. And I've been asked to take up this challenge of formulating a few concluding remarks on these 4 years of research in no more than 10 minutes. So it's quite a big challenge. And of course, what I'm about to say, I hope will by no means be the last word on the BABEL project. Not only are there still publications in progress, doctoral thesis nearing completion, and also conference papers in preparation, but I also hope that the results we've just presented will continue to fuel research into this strange and controversial object called the UBI, the Unconditional Basic Income. And of course, I also fully agree with what has just been said by Femke. I also hope that this research will trigger people's imagination about welfare reform. So what I'm going to do now is just make a few and too selective observations based on my own subjective experience of research into this topic. And my main concerns in the last few years working on basic income have been about the ethical, the political, and economic aspects of the UBI debate. And I will briefly touch upon these aspects in turn in a very simplified way. First, let me then say a few words about ethics. I start with ethics, of course, because as you know, and as John Rawls famously said, justice is the first virtue of social institutions. And in fact, the ethical justifications for a UBI have apparently at least been or remained, let's say, relatively marginal in the context of our project. Our aim was certainly not to settle the complex question of the fairness of basic income. So let's say that we rather took for granted the idea that UBI was at least considered by some as desirable in the academic literature as well as in the real world of politics. And we wanted to reflect more on, as you have seen, its implementation and on its possibly perverse effects. So as was put by Yves Marx in one of his recent publications, I quote, "This is not the place to repeat in much detail the many philosophical and ethical arguments that have been put forward in defense of a basic income." End quote. So this seems to be a good summary of our take in this discussion. In other words, we wanted to take basic income supporters seriously, but we also wanted to show that they perhaps tend to underestimate the gap, let's say, between desirability and feasibility. Or as we write in our final report, which will be available soon, there is, I quote, "there is still a large gap between wish and reality." However, I also think that ethics was never far away during these 4 years for several reasons, and I cannot mention all of them. One of them is, of course, that many of us have been interested in that issue and have, including among the young researchers, have read philosophical essays about basic income. But let me just take two examples taken from our exploration of this discussion about basic income to show that our exploration of the economic, political, or even sociological dimensions has often brought us back to the question of ethical justification. First, implicitly, of course, implicitly, of course, when we explore the impact of a basic income on poverty, as we have done today, we always have in mind the idea that the existence of a high poverty rate poses a problem not only of efficiency, but also of social justice. And this, of course, was never really made explicit, but it's certainly part of why we are interested in exploring the idea of a basic income, and especially its impact on poverty reduction. We have an ideal in mind, and that ideal is, of course, a welfare state that reduces poverty. Second example, and that's perhaps more explicit, in the interviews that we've conducted with political players, as was presented by Floriane, or in the research about citizens' attitudes, as explained today by Marie-Laure, the issue of the ethical justification of basic income came up again and again. So, for instance, as we have shown, the moral norm, the value of reciprocity, the work ethic, informs political positions on the subject. It is the attachment to that norm that explains the reluctance to endorse a basic income, or, for instance, the fact that one political party in Belgium supports a participation income rather than a universal unconditional basic income. That norm of reciprocity is crucial. Okay, this example leads me to briefly explore the second aspect that I want to insist on, the political dimensions of the UBI debate. And these dimensions, I think, are closely linked to ethics, as I have just shown. You have seen that we have adopted a fairly broad conception of politics. We have focused on the positions of political parties, which in Belgium, as many of you know, remain the key players, but we have broadened the perspective to include the gatekeepers, the social partners, trade unions, employers, but we also have analyzed the question of public support to the measure. So I won't go back to the results that have been presented here, but I'd like to stress the fact that, to my knowledge, this systematic exploration of the various political dimensions in a single country is very rare, if not non-existent, in the scientific literature on basic income. So, of course, you may find articles, papers, essays about these different dimensions, let's say the role of unions or the take of political parties, but are never addressed together. And this is the first time that such a complete picture has been drawn up for a single country, I think. Moreover, I can also add the fact that the question of political feasibility has never really been central to the literature on basic income. I remember, so our friends and colleagues, Jürgen de Wispelar and José Noguera, wrote an article about the political feasibility of UBI in 2012. And in that article, they said, much work remains to be done to further our understanding of the challenges faced by basic income advocates and the strategies available to overcome these. And in fact, I think it's still true today. We still lack empirical data about the political feasibility of a basic income. And that's perhaps because most basic income, let's say most papers about basic income are written by convinced, let's say, believers who may be a bit uninterested in power relations, although these power relations will, in the end, determine the fate of the proposal they are defending. And these power relations will, in the end, determine the compromises that have to be reached on measures that may be less ambitious but more realistic. I would also like to stress the fact that our systematic research into public support is quite unprecedented in its scope. And of course, it's clear that public opinion exerts a strong influence on the positions of political players. So for instance, just to take one of the results that we've achieved the fact that higher income and highly educated individuals are more skeptical towards a basic income, especially when it implies higher taxation, is of course likely to be unsurprising, but it remains directly relevant if you look at political feasibility of a basic income, because its implementation will require widespread public and political backing. Okay, let me then turn finally quickly to the economics of basic income. You don't have to be a Marxist, and I'm not referring here to one of the co-promoters of this research. You don't have to be a Marxist to know that it's this economic dimension that is the most crucial politically. And it's clear, I think, here that our research adds many qualifications, let's say, to the fiery rhetoric of basic income advocates. As we have seen today, the concrete design of a basic income, its level, of course, but also the way it's financed and the types of benefits it will replace, will strongly influence the type of redistributive effects of a basic income, and therefore, potentially, its political feasibility. Here again, our research shows, as you have seen with the presentation by Elise Aerts, that a partial basic income, not a full one replacing most of the benefits, a partial basic income may be the most promising avenue to be explored by those who want to push for a generous welfare reform. So a welfare reform that would not simply be based on cuts, as is currently discussed in Belgium by perhaps the new government, but a welfare reform that will significantly improve the situation of the worst off without affecting too much the net contributors. As with the political aspect, the economic aspect also includes a sociological dimension, specifically designed to test the effects on employment. And especially as you have seen with these very interesting and original vignette experiments. And I think here, to be very quick on that it's quite important to emphasize that our results confirm the findings of previous research on the subject carried out outside Belgium. And I stress that point. If a UBI were to be implemented, the majority of those wanting to change something aim at combining a reduction of paid work with other economic or social activities. So to quote the slides of Cyrille, only a small group would not perform any paid work. And this is not a small thing, as this remains the major objection used by basic income opponents. Remember that reciprocity objection. A basic income would, they say, foster inactivity and promote idleness. And yet, our results show that it may perhaps not be the case. So here I'd like to paraphrase the title of Yves Marx's latest chapter on the topic. Yves has entitled his chapter, I quote, "Basic Income Advocates, Sober Up." I could also say, looking at our results, perhaps basic income opponents sober up. They may be a compromise between opponents and advocates around more incremental reforms, as we have seen. I just conclude by two very brief points about two aspects that we briefly touched upon in our research, but that remain perhaps a bit underexplored in our research and in the literature. I was thinking about that when listening to Loek, Groot's remarks. What's next? What would be the next steps for such a study? I think first, we still need to further explore the impact of UBI in terms of gender equality. We have been discussing this a little bit today. If a UBI were to be implemented, we have seen in our research, women would be more inclined to shift from paid employment to unpaid social activities. Of course, you can consider this as unproblematic. It's just more freedom given to each individual to choose to leave the labor market, but it raises concerns about gender disparities in labor market participation. And of course, we have also seen in Elise Aerts' presentation that making benefits individual, so individualizing benefits, may be detrimental to single mothers especially. So that gender aspect, I think, needs to be further explored. And finally, there is another point that we did not really tackle, and that's the issue of migration. So I finish with that point. We show that public opinion is less inclined to accept a basic income if it is accessible to paid also to newcomers. And once again, here our results tend to confirm the very few previous results findings on this issue. I think that given the importance taken by the issue of migration in contemporary politics, this should be further explored and has been neglected by UBI researchers. Some may conclude that in order to improve its political feasibility, a UBI should be paid to nationals only. But this would obviously raise legal issues, especially within the EU. But above all, I think it would also raise serious fairness issues. And of course, here we're back at ethics. Remember, justice is the first virtue of social institutions. Thank you very much for your attention. Also, congratulations to the whole team.
Inspiring concluding remarks. Absolutely. Thank you very much. I suggest in the remaining time we still address some of the questions that were already posted in the Q&A, or that you can still put in the chat, or if it's a very long question, we might also be able to give you the chance to speak or to ask your question directly. But maybe starting from what we have in the Q&A, there was already a bit of a debate or a conversation starting about the issue of non-take-up. And how that is related to the microsimulation results that we have found, or the effects on poverty of a UBI. So maybe
just one thing, Tijs, you've seen that there is the conversation and also the Q&R. So there are two places where you have questions.
Yes, exactly.
I think that's new in Teams. I don't know, but
yeah, you have the chat and then the Q&A. So I'm combining the both.
Okay.
But maybe the people from the team from Antwerp can take this question that is in the Q&A, related to how our results might change or are different if we take into account non-take-up, especially if means tested benefits.
Yes, of course. I think that is one of the great limitations, that we were not able to say something more about this issue of non-take-up, because of course we all know that even in our developed welfare states, that is a big issue. And that is an issue that a basic income could very easily solve. So yeah, of course, if we were to be able to take non-take-up into account, then that mostly would have an impact on the poverty level in the baseline. If we take non-take-up into account, the poverty levels in the baseline would likely be higher. There are many people not taking up benefits that they are eligible for. So when considering non-take-up, I think we might probably will have the conclusion that a basic income would have a slightly bigger impact on poverty, because then people would have something to rely on instead of having nothing. But I do want to make the remark here that we know from another very interesting research project that has been done here in Belgium, called the TAKE project, that looked into the problem of non-take-up in Belgium. And from that research, we know that non-take-up is the highest among people that are eligible for small amounts. So we see that non-take-up typically is not very high for people who really have nothing to rely on. They usually eventually will go for social assistance or any other related social benefits. And it's mainly people that are eligible for these smaller amounts of benefits that are not taking it up. So in that sense, the basic income will have this, would be a smaller issue that it would have to mitigate. But yeah, definitely, it would simply mean that a basic income would have a bigger poverty reducing impact that we are showing now. Of course, when we specifically look at the 60% poverty line, and if it is, say, what here, and people really have nothing, then the basic income also needs to be high enough to lift those people above the poverty line to actually see an effect in that specific poverty indicator. So it's also, again, a bit of an interesting story that will have many interactions, and that I hope that in future research we can definitely take into account.
Okay, thank you, Elise. If I may, perhaps we can stay with the Antwerp team, because